Science is interesting, and if you don't agree, you can fuck off.
Welcome to the Darwin Digest, episode 44. This week we are talking about some of the more separate of the human race. I'm joined once again by my co-hosts, Kathy Princess.
Hello.
And Lawrence Drake.
Hello.
All right, yeah, so it should be a interesting episode this week. We've got everything from Africans to Aboriginals. Lawrence, do you want to get us started off with Aboriginals?
Yeah, sure. I think it fits well for my section to go first. A, for Aboriginal, and also an interesting thing about Aborigines is they're a very old population, so you're kind of looking back in time when you study them. So I think a lot of us are probably aware that Aborigines didn't have any of the things that we would associate with modern or semi-modern civilization. For instance, they had no agriculture. They didn't domesticate any animals, and they didn't practice metallurgy, and they hunted with spears, and they didn't use bows and arrows. No buildings, no written languages. They didn't have any chiefs or any sort of centralized state. They were nomadic hunter-gatherers in small bands, using temporary shelters if they were going to build shelters, and they used stone tools. So I guess you could say that they are a Stone Age population. They never got past the Stone Age, which means, well, it's good if you're an anthropologist. You're looking back in time when you look at them. You can get clues on how people lived in the Stone Age by studying the Australian Aborigines. And so as a bit of background, they've been in Australia for over 40,000 years. And they're some of the first stone tool using people. During the Pleistocene Australia and New Guinea, they used to actually be connected through a land bridge, but between 12 and 8,000 years ago, that continental ice sheets melted, and that flooded this land bridge, and that cut off New Guinea from Australia. And so New Guineans were actually more advanced, because they had things like bows and arrows, and they practiced pottery. They had permanent settlements. They constructed houses, and they used a larger number of tools, although they still use stone tools. And they're closely related to Aborigines because they actually descend from populations that migrated from Southeast Asia. And they reached Australia by hopping along the islands of the Indonesian archipelago. So Aborigines have genetic similarities with New Guineans, and also populations in South Asians like Filipinos, Malays, and people in the Andaman Islands off Burma. Of course, they don't really look like Philippines today because, that population has undergone a lot of admixture and change. But the Philippines traded with the Chinese, and we all know that they were colonized by the Spanish. So, yeah, there's been large population changes there. Even the Americans have been to the Philippines and left their stamp, genetically speaking. It's kind of funny, America hasn't really done European-style colonialism, but they did have a crack at it in the Philippines. And, the Philippines got independence and told the Americans to get out, and now that China's increasing its economic and military might, and they want to expand their sphere of influence, the Filipinos are like, Americans, come back, build some bases. You got that guy, Duterte, he pretends to give the US the finger, but his generals are like, shh, don't listen to him. But anyway, these populations from South Asia, they eventually reached northern Australia, and they spread out and colonised basically the entire continent, which is no small feat because Australia's a pretty damn big continent. It's almost as big as Europe and North America. It could definitely eat a few United Kingdoms and have space left over for dessert. The Aborigines populated basically every area on the continent. It took about 5,000 years to migrate from the southwest to the southeast and Tasmania. And getting to Pleistocene Australia from Bali was probably done by just making rafts. And rafts are, I mean, they're pretty primitive, but they'll do the job if you just want to hop between islands. Even though Aborigines are genetically related to South Asians, there's something that, a distinction needs to be made. There's almost no cultural overlap because they've been like almost in total isolation. There was about 250 languages spoken by Australian Aboriginal tribes in the 18th century, but none of them have any relation to the languages of South Asia. And even when you're talking genetics, they're most closely related to these South Asian populations, but you've got to keep in mind that it's still a very distant relationship, which, is evidence for just how isolated they've been. They're very, you can just look at them. They're very different in appearance, different bone structure to modern South Asians. But you also have to keep in mind that modern South Asians have undergone population replacements, and they're not the same as the stock that originally migrated into Papua New Guinea and Australia. So that's something important to keep in mind. They have diverged a fair bit from New Guineans, which New Guineans have the B blood group, along with almost all other populations in the world, but that blood group is absent in Aborigines. New Guineans have hair that's similar to sub-Saharan Africans, but Aborigines have wavy, straight hair. So if you were to come down off a spaceship from Mars, you might think that Aborigines are genetically related to sub-Saharan Africans because they have many similar characteristics, but they're actually closest to South Asians, or to be more precise, the early populations that lived in South Asia that seeded that early migration. In terms of their relations with Europeans, bringing it more towards the modern era, just a bit of background. New South Wales was discovered in 1770 by Captain Cook, and he thought, he turned up and thought it was a bit shit, but it might make a good place to dump criminals and scum. So that's what we are, criminals and scum. By 1787 and 1853, there were about 150,000 people who were transported on what they called hell ships. Because it wasn't exactly a nice prospect to make that trip. A lot of deaths, a lot of disease, and it's not a lot of fun. Travel by ship during that time was, you took your life in your hands when you did it. They did it as an alternative to executing people. They didn't really want to keep doing that, so they thought, well, let's just exile them somewhere instead. There were also a lot of political prisoners, like the Luddites, a lot of revolutionaries and things like that. The paradox that is that Australia was actually one of the most loyal to the British Empire as opposed to the US, which, as we know, became a rebel colony. And the treatment of convicts wasn't really that great, but there were a few differences. They were treated a little better than slaves, but after their sentence was up, and they got sentences kind of in the range of 7 years, and they got sentenced for, minor property crimes, stealing a chicken, things like that, like things that you would get a slap on the wrist for. But punishments were pretty harsh back then. If you stole a chicken, you could end up being shipped off to Australia on a 7-year stretch. And, the trip itself is a huge punishment, given the disease and high mortality rates. But there was, there was something to look forward to. Some of them were given property before their sentence was up, and they could grow crops on their own property. And after their sentence was over, they could freely sell their labour and own property. Governor Lachlan Macquarie, he ran the colony as a sort of benign, enlightened despot between 1809 and 1821. And he had an interesting thing. He believed that convicts could be redeemed. So he improved conditions on the ships, and that cut the death rate by more than half. And he used convicts to build up, infrastructure here and build various buildings in places like Botany Bay. And he wanted to reduce dependence on imported food. So he offered 30 acres of land to prisoners after their sentence was up, which sounds pretty good, given property values today. By 1821, there were more free people than convicts in Australia, and only 1 in 14 of those recently freed convicts chose to return to Britain. So it was actually becoming really successful as a colony, economically prosperous. It became so successful that criminals actually wanted to be transported to Australia. It's like, it was better than being stuck in a dank dungeon in Britain. They wanted to be transported here because it was a good deal. In 1788, back to the subject of Aborigines, there was about 300,000 Aborigines in Australia. Many of them died from disease that the Europeans brought with them because they had no resistance to these sorts of diseases. Similar to what happened with American Indians with European settlement. Now Macquarie was a paternalist, so he thought that he could turn Aborigines into property-owning farmers like what he did to the convicts. But, the efforts didn't turn out very well. In 1815, he settled 16 Aborigines on a farm in Middle Head, and he gave them huts and he gave them a boat, and they ended up losing the boat and they just wandered back into the bush. So it didn't really work out in the end. But compared to Maoris in New Zealand, the Aborigines were fairly indifferent to settlers, like at the early stages. There were conflicts, of course, like the Mile Creek Massacre in 1838, where farmers killed 28 Aborigines. But as agriculture spread out, there was a kind of low-level war that developed, and that culminated in places like Tasmania, where there was the Black War between colonists and Aborigines, which killed about 200 settlers and between 600 and 900 Aborigines, and disease and warfare pretty much killed the entire Aboriginal population of Tasmania. So there's ongoing debate as to whether that constitutes a genocide. It needs to be remembered that the British government provided some degree of restraint on settlers, but when you think about it, how much restraint can you exercise on settlers in a far distant continent, off on frontier lands? In real terms, not much. But the historian Nicholas Clements noted that unlike the sort of ideological genocides by 20th century totalitarian movements like Nazism and communism, the settlers were mostly involved in tit-for-tat revenge killings and raids. It was a low-level guerrilla war. And yet both sides dished it out and took it. There's actually a good article by Theodore Dalrymple, real name, of course, Anthony Daniels. It's called Why Intellectuals Like Genocide. It's in the New English Review. I'll put up a link to that. It's about a guy named Keith Windshuttle, and he wrote a book in 2002 called The Fabrication of Aboriginal History. And he said that there was about 120 Aborigines killed by settlers, the police and military, and that was about the same number of settlers killed. And he said that therefore that doesn't constitute a genocide, and that most Aborigines actually died from disease, and their birth rates declined because the settlers introduced sexually transmitted diseases to them. And at the time, this caused a major storm in academia, and there were lengthy denunciations written. But it seems to be in line with mainstream historians in America that agree that most of the Indians died from disease. So it's definitely something plausible. I've got a few stats, like basic things. IQ, estimated at 62 by Richard Lynn. Life expectancy is 69.1 years for males, 73.7 for females. That's about 10 years less than the national average. And according to the Australian Institute of Criminology, imprisonment rates are about 12 times the national average, and for juveniles it's about 24 times the rate. So definitely outcomes are not the same as other groups in Australia, whites, East Asians. Lots of money gets spent trying to close these gaps, but so far they don't work, and I think we all know why. It's got a lot to do with IQ and just differences in temperament and abilities between population groups. But that's it from me, so I'll open it up to comments and questions.
Yeah, Aboriginals are interesting, like you said, because they've been so heavily isolated, and they've as far as their tool usage is concerned, they're one of the least developed groups, if not the least developed group, like least developed group on the face of the earth. So they're a really interesting thing to look at.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Like they're a gold mine if you're an anthropologist.
Mm-hmm. And I think one comment I wanted to make from a more genetic point of view was that, despite them looking a lot like sub-Saharan Africans, they're actually very recessive in their traits. So, for example, an Aboriginal mulatto looks much more white than an African mulatto, and an Aboriginal quadroon is basically almost entirely white. It's very interesting how these things play out.
Yeah. That's right. I mean, they do have a lot of commonality, as I mentioned, with Papua New Guineans. Just out of interest, there's an interesting video. I mean, I can't remember the title of it, but if you look for something like Papua New Guineans' first contact with white people, it's a video of like an anthropologist encountering a tribe in Papua New Guinea that's never seen a white person before. And they're pretty freaked out. They're like reaching their hand out to touch his skin just to see if he's actually real. And it's kind of interesting. And there's actually a sort of cottage industry of like like Papua New Guineans and, people in the Amazon rainforest. They get journalists and anthropologists, and they say, I can take you to a tribe that's never encountered civilization before, and it's kind of a scam. They just say that they've never encountered civilization before, but they really haven't. And they put like not blindfolds, but they don't tell the journalists and anthropologists where they're going, because their path is a closely guarded secret. That's their bread and butter. So they don't want them to find out like how to navigate there themselves. But there's been like journalists and anthropologists that have been taken on these trips and paid money to these guides, only to find these tribes that are very relaxed around these Europeans. So, and they've got like plastic beads and things which they wouldn't have been able to make themselves. So that kind of clued them into, hang on, there's something fishy is going on here. You're just saying that these people have never encountered European or modern civilization before. But yeah, that's the thing.
Yeah, anthropologists being defrauded by the native population is not anything new. What was her name of the?
Yeah, it's a great tradition.
Yeah, trolling the scientists is something the natives are very good at. What was the name of
the scientists? Oh, sorry, go on.
I was going to say, what was the name of that female anthropologist, the one who wrote about the sex lives of...
Margaret Mead.
Margaret
yeah,
Mead,
I was going to mention her, that like she got trolled by... she trolled herself, really, by wanting them to behave in a certain way and just cherry-picking her evidence and stuff.
Well, it was also the fact that they were just making stuff up.
Yeah.
It's pretty great. Yeah, so yeah, it's just, this is she's from the, from like the Gould style of, we're all equal, blank slate, all that sort of stuff. And so, yeah, like you said, she went in there with an expectation and she asked about it. And they just like, yeah, sure, yep. It's one of the more amusing things to have happened, I think, in like the course of human research. Anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, as a hardcore Marxist, what they told her was just too good for her to... She couldn't resist. It was too good to be true. And so she swallowed it hook, line and sinker. And the thing is, when she published her work, most other... Like, it was in complete contradiction to all the other data that had been obtained on these people. And there was no shortage of it because, you know, the British Empire, when they encountered new populations, they liked to study them. They liked to write about them. And the interesting thing is, like, okay, you've got all these populations. They've got no written languages. They've only got oral history, which, you know, it's not going to be that reliable over generations. And so they don't actually know what their history is.
Yeah, it's all oral.
They've got their, like, myths and legends and stuff, you know, the dream time, all that kind of thing, but they don't have an objective history. So history basically was written by Europeans.
Yeah,
I mean, without Europeans, they wouldn't know what their history is.
Yeah, I mean, European objective history is racist and privileged and patriarchal, and it's not... It's just an equal way of knowing. It's an inferior way of knowing to the dream time, don't you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of funny.
Instinct-based technologies are better.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. In Australia, it's like almost a bit of a faux pas to talk about like Aboriginal, like the Aboriginal descent coming from off Australia. Like, no, they just sort of like sprung up here, you know, from the rainbow serpent and all that sort of crap. Like that's... everyone knows it's not true, but it's kind of like it's considered almost rude to talk about where they actually came from because it offends their religion.
Yeah, because they think they sprung out from a rock or something.
Yeah, it's silly. I did just bring up Margaret Mead's like 3 of the claims that she made, like this sort of just to put in perspective how crappy her work was. So she was working with the Samoans, who are a very they're quite a warlike people. Like, you know, they're actually not that bad to get along with, but you know they can be riled up.
They're big, aren't they?
Yeah, they're
like
very big.
Big and angry looking.
Yeah, a lot of them are quite, you know, they live up to the fat and jovial stereotype as well. But yeah, so in brief, her comparative study revealed a full range of contrasting gender roles. Among the Aparash, both men and women were peaceful in temperament, and neither men nor women made war, which, like, you know, this is a very warlike people. Among the Mungadamor, the opposite was true. Both men and women were warlike in temperament, and among the Chambul were different, and the Chambul were different from both. The men primped and spent their time decorating themselves, whilst women worked and were the practical ones. The opposite of how it seemed. Yeah, so like.
That's most tribes, though. Most tribes, men just spend their time doing nothing and women do all the work because the men are the warriors. That's all over in Africa. That's how it happens. You know, women do the menial labor.
Yeah, but it's like it's the narrative that she's very obviously trying to put on here. So yeah, I just thought I'd put that there for those who don't know about Mead. It's interesting to look into.
Yeah, we did an episode on that like ages ago.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I remember that came up.
Shall I?
Yeah, unless Lawrence, you've got any more to add?
No, that's it for me.
Oh yeah, well
Okay.
then tell us about the Islanders, Kathy.
Yes. So I'm going to talk about a people's possibly even more primitive than the Aboriginals. I mean, the mind boggles. But these are the Andamanese, and they are the indigenous peoples of the Andaman Islands, which are part of India's Andaman and Nicobar Islands Union Territory in the southeastern part of the Bay of Bengal. And these people are among the groups that are considered the Negritos, owing to the dark skin and small stature. They all traditionally live a hunter-gatherer lifestyle and appear to have lived in substantial isolation for thousands of years. And actually, an offshoot of this tribe, the Sentinelese, and another tribe that I can't remember the name of, they basically, even now, they live in complete Stone Age conditions, and they refuse contact, and they just kill anybody who comes in their way. So yeah, very, very ethno-nationalist, those people. So they seem to have arrived at the Andaman Islands around the latest glacial maximum 26,000 years ago or so. So these people include the Great Andamanese and the Jaravas of the Great Andaman Archipelago, the Jangil of Rutland Island, the Onge of Little Andaman, and the Sentinelese of North Sentinel Island that I just mentioned. And in the end of the 18th century, when they first came into contact with outsiders, mainly evil colonial white people, there were around 7,000 Andamanese. And in a story that echoes everything around the world, in the next century, they were mainly wiped out by diseases, violence, etc., vices, that sort of thing. And today there are about 450 Andamanese. It's hard to tell because, like I said, they're extremely hostile to anybody. And a lot of the sub-tribes are basically extinct. So only the Jarawa and the Sentinelese maintain steadfast independence, refusing contact, like I mentioned. And the more in the greater Andaman Islands, those people have they're extremely admixed, and they hardly have any of their original traits left. So interestingly, and this is a lesson for the future, I guess, the Greater Andamanese continue to practice infanticide on any miscegenated progeny. So there's an interesting fact for you. So there were a lot of different theories on how these people came about, because they superficially they look a lot like pygmies in Africa. There was the hypothesis put forward by the Victorians that they're basically an offshoot of some African tribe that made their way into these islands, but that doesn't seem to be the case. Through genetic lineage, these people are of South Asian origin, and any kind of similarity to pygmies, etc., is an example of convergent evolution. So they, their sort of short stature, their very, very dark skin, their nappy hair, and that it's all converged to look like rather African, even though genetically they don't really have much in common. They're basically come from the same origin as the Dravidians in India, really, and there is some resemblance of people towards that. So they all seem to have the M2 mitochondrial lineage, which is a signal of an early southern movement of humans through Asia. And they all have, or almost all have, the Y haplogroup D, which again is a very Asian haplogroup. So that kind of disproved the Victorian hypothesis. And I don't want to lie, but there does seem to be evidence that the Andamanese are the only people in the whole entire world, apart from the now extinct Tasmanian Aboriginals, that seem to have forgotten how to make fire. This is disputed, but it isn't unbelievable, if you know what I mean. So that's the Andamanese. They're very interesting. They're very they're very, very, very isolated, and I think they're genuinely they're kind of genuinely hostile to any contact from the outside world, and they have retained a lot of their culture, whatever their culture is, and a lot of their traits. So they're very, very interesting, and I just thought it was worth to have a little to mention them, because I think many people haven't even heard of these people existing at all. So questions about that?
Yeah, I mean, they basically kill anyone who turns up, and like you've got like Indian researchers that tried to go there, and some of them were killed, and some of them just made a beeline back to the boats and barely escaped with their lives. Incidentally, when they come, they wear no clothes. They haven't invented clothes, and when they actually see a ship come past, they grab their dicks for some reason. I don't know,
My dick.
Do they actually? I didn't know that. That's really funny. I was going to say...
There's photos of them doing it. Fortunately, they're distant, blurry photos, but there are photos of them.
I was going to say, like, they're the ideal, like, ethno-nationalist state, you know. They have no need for destructive technologies like fire. They're perfectly, you know, ethnically homogenous.
Homogenous. Yeah, they kill any admixed babies, so...
Yeah, so...
Very principled.
But then they're my Dickens, so I don't know about that.
Yeah.
Like, if they could build a wall, they probably would, but they don't actually have wall-building technology. They'll just throw a spear at you. That's as good as a wall.
Yeah.
A wall of spears, yeah.
Well, I guess they've got a Medic wall.
I didn't know that. That's actually kind of amusing.
Yeah, no, but I have kind of a certain respect for these people, you know, compared to like Aboriginals and whatever. They're so hostile, and they really don't want to take any part in like modern society because they're obviously completely unsuited for it, and they, you know, they're principled and they maintain their homogeneity. So what's not to like?
And, you know, truth be told, if they were to integrate, sorry, Lawrence, if they were to integrate, then, you know, they probably would just die out. They'd just be lost in the waves of modern humanity. So, good on them.
I absolutely agree with what you're saying, and if they don't want to partake in modern civilization, they shouldn't be forced to do it. I mean, they've been on that island. They were there first. Who cares if they don't want to buy iPhones?
Yeah, they don't want to participate in the global Zog machine, so therefore they must be forced to convert.
Yeah, it's a good thing they're not white, otherwise they'd be fucked.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is kind of amusing. Like, you know, there's the obvious argument on the other side is, but how would they know that they don't want to be a part of the a part of this unless they, you know, experience themselves? And it's like, well,
because they kill everybody who comes to bother them.
Well, no,
so
so like, how do they know that they wouldn't actually prefer it unless they tried it? Which I think is a bit, you know, it's a
Jewy question.
It is. It's very it's also very. I was going to say it's a very Anglo way of looking at that as well. But I just wanted to
same thing.
Put that there. Yeah, pretty much. It's just like it's the whole that's the like the I guess like the modern missionary sort of perspective.
You get the Methodist like annoying women come in and say, "Oh, these children, they just don't know what they want. Therefore, we must save them from themselves and give them Christianity and homosexuality and democracy." And
yeah, it's not cause. The only difference is not the light of God. It's the light of Zog.
Yeah, dildo leg.
Yeah, pretty much. And
they don't have the drone fluff. Like drone attached dildos yet, therefore they are very unfortunate and disenfranchised. And
well,
stuff.
Actually, that dildo attached, the dildo attached to the drone would probably help them with them dicking at all the helicopters and stuff.
Oh yeah, they could just fly the dildo drone out into the whatever ship seems to come past them.
Yeah, well, there you go. We're only helping their society, right? Anyway. I did not know that they did that. That's just really that made my day.
Yeah.
Did we have any more? Did you have any more, Kathy? Did you want to continue? Or?
There's a bit more autism I could go into, but I don't think people would find it very interesting. I could just say there's a genetic difference between the greater Andaman archipelago and the little Andaman, that there seem to be more kind of ancient admixture in the greater Andaman, and the little Andaman are more kind of unique. But that's all there's to it, really. I mean, they don't even have fire. what else can you say about them?
Yeah,
They haven't got like like the Aboriginals. They've been exposed to sort of Western societies long enough to develop all the kind of bad habits that we know them. We know about them, like the petrols, chugging and that sort of thing. But these people, they were spared that, thankfully, and long may it continue.
Yeah, definitely. I guess we'll move on then. Before we jump into my bit, though, we've just got a couple of little bits of housekeeping announcements to make. I haven't talked about it in a long while, especially since, I guess, mostly because, the big break that we had. But the website is being worked on. I will say it's almost complete. And so look out for that soon. We'll let you know when it's actually up. And other than that, we've started doing videos. I talked about it a couple of times and then never got around to it. I'm finally getting around to doing it. We've got one video up on the YouTube, on the YouTubes. Hopefully that'll be somewhere between one a week two a week to one every 2 weeks. That sort of, not a definitive release schedule, but
as and when it's appropriate.
Yeah, I want to start going through some of the older episodes and just take out interesting stuff from that, re-record it, and then add in relevant relevant graphs and stuff like that. So there's actually some there's actually a visual aspect to things that will actually help get our point across. But yeah, hopefully more of those will be coming out soon. Also lets us do things that are interesting but don't have enough material for an entire episode on. I looked at the and also things that are a little bit off kilter, the video up at the moment is the White Helmet's use of PPE in the recent attacks, or their lack of it, and I go into some detail about that, especially in regards to secondary exposure that the Japanese Tokyo sarin attacks experienced and comparing them. So, I can do things like that. And hopefully we'll have more of those coming out soon. So yeah, look for that, and I'll put a link to that in the description. That's that, and I guess I will jump into onto my topic. And Kathy's was a little bit more primitive than Lawrence's, and I think mine are almost more primitive again, but they've been modernized to a degree. The Khoisan, which are the group of hunter-gatherers that originally inhabited much of southern Africa before the Bantu peoples migrated from Central and East Africa. They consist of two ethnic groups, the San and the Khoi. These groups are also known as the Bushmen and the Hottentots, respectively. The Khoi, you might recall, we talked about Hottentots in a previous episode. They're the ones with the hyper-enlarged derriere, I guess, which is probably...
The hanging labia.
Yeah, I'll get to that. Which is what they're most famous for. More properly, it's called steatopagia, which is a high degree of fat accumulation around the buttocks. Just quickly though, the Khoi does have these are two separate populations, but they originated from the same group that first split off. A little bit more about that later, but the Hottentots have a high degree of interbreeding with both the Bantu and other population groups, so their genetics is a little bit mixed up, whereas the San are more they're more pure. Anyway, so let's talk about these the fat butts, I guess. So it's deposit around the fat. It's deposit of large amounts of fat in and around the buttocks. The deposit is not just confined to the buttock region, but extends to the outside and front of the thighs, forming a thick layer reaching sometimes to the knee. It's specifically a female feature, but does occur to a lesser degree in men too. This trait is also found in pygmies of Central Africa and the Andaman Isles, which is Southeast Asia, but that's in a far lesser amount. The Khoisan see this as a beauty sign, begins in infancy and is fully developed by the time of their first pregnancy, which is usually around 14, 15, I believe. It's often accompanied by the formation, like Kathy said, of an elongated labia. The labia minora may extend as much as 4 inches outside the vulva, which is huge. A Boer in the 18th century describes the trait as the lining of the body appears to be loose, so that in certain places part of it dangles out. They have to themselves this peculiarity from other races, that most of them possess finger-shaped appendages, always double, hanging down from the private parts. These are evidently nymphae or labia minora. James Cook noted in 1771, whilst passing the Cape Colony, the great question among natural historians whether the women of this country have or have not that fleshy flap or apron which has been called the sinus pudoris. The most recent testimony of travellers commands us to put the cutaneous ventral of female Hottentots in the same category as the human tail, and in like manner to relegate it to the fables. So yeah, it's kind of like, it's this interesting kind of like extreme adaptation that we don't really see in most people. That's often compared to the hyperinflatable buttocks of the baboon as well, which they actually fulfill similar roles in sexual signaling and stuff like that. But anyway, back to the Khoisan in general. They have one of the lowest life expectancies on Earth. Around about 50% of their children die before the age of 15, 20% die within their first year, mostly from gastrointestinal infections. The average life expectancy is about 45 to 50 years. Respiratory infections and malaria. Malaria is actually really interesting. The major reasons for death in adults. Only 10% become older than 60 years. And malaria is interesting because their previous mode of living, which is hunter-gathering, actually kind of protected them from malaria, and that has some interesting, because they didn't have communities where stagnant water could pile up and that sort of thing. But yeah, so I'll get to that in a bit as well, but it's got some interesting implications on the genetic differences between them and other African groups. As a population group, because they never begun to move to sustainable agriculture, the two groups, the San were hunter-gatherers and the Khoi were pastoralists. Basically, they just had large... They had essentially begun to domesticate cattle, and they moved from place to place, gathering grains and things like that, and other meats as they went. But they never settled down, so they kind of, I guess they kind of look at that as an in between of the agricultural revolution. It's like a stepping stone. But as a group, they never began sustainable agriculture. Sitting down on one spot and farming that for generations. And this is matched in their IQ, which is actually was originally a lot lower than Australian Aboriginals, but that was an estimate. It was originally estimated to be 54, but more recently it's likely around 60, which is lower than the Australian Aboriginal 64 to 62. Is also kind of interesting. It makes them on par with the dumbest people on Earth, which is what you would expect for people who a group of people who never moved into agriculture. And genetically, they are as different from Africans as from other African groups as Europeans are from Africans. But it's not like, don't imagine like a line, think more like a triangle, because we are more different from them than from other Africans, but there isn't, it's not like double the amount. So yeah, just sort of imagine like a slightly skewed triangle when you're thinking about the genetic difference between the three of us. So yeah, and why they're so different is because at least 200,000 years ago, they began splitting off from other humans, which makes them the earliest group to split. That's like I said, it's probably a lot older, and they were fully isolated by, again, at least 100,000 years ago, which is about the earliest that the other groups started splitting off. So they were well and truly isolated before. Basically, the point is they were well and truly isolated before we got to the point where the other groups started separating. Bushman genetic analysis reveals some interesting differences between Bushmen and the more traditional Bantu population. Some of these differences, are actually fairly easily explained by their lifestyle, just different adaptations. The hunting and gathering in a hot, dry climate makes them dark-skinned gatherers. So obviously they lack the European alterations there that give them lighter-coloured skin and allow them to cope with eating dairy products. All of the Bushmen have so I'm reading from a paper here, or analysis of a paper which I'll include in the description. So all of the Bushmen that they tested had a version of the vitamin D receptor that is associated with denser bones, and 3 of them had a variant linked to better sprinting performance. Some of the SNPs granted the carrier the ability to taste bitter plant chemicals, which obviously hunter-gatherers would find useful to avoid toxic plants. One of the variants allowed the breaking down of potentially, there's more research needs to be done on this, potentially certain types of, allows them to break down certain foreign substances, which is secreted by local parasites, so there's possibly an interesting adaptation there. And there's some implication that they've got some kidney adaptations which are better at reabsorbing chloride ions, which reduces the loss of salt and water, which is useful for living in the desert. So the malaria thing, coming back to that, is where it kind of gets a bit interesting. Again, the 5 Africans that were tested of the Khoisan group all lacked a genetic variant that was specific to Africa and the grants resistance against malaria. It's the sickle cell mutation. And they don't have any of it, which is interesting because out of 5, I believe statistically there's likely to be at least 1 allele in there. And it's possible that because of their lifestyle, which again keeps them from settling down in any way, that they didn't need resistance against malaria because they would move away from, there weren't necessarily stagnant water sources around them. They could just avoid those areas. Whereas if you have a semi-settled style of lifestyle, which most Africans had at that time, like you are in areas for extended periods of time, and that becomes an issue. They didn't have, potentially don't have this particular allele in their population, which is, like I said, it's really fascinating. It shows like the difference because the sickle cell is like the stereotypical African mutation, same way that now I'm blanking. Same way that lactose tolerance is typically white. So there's a whole heap of various genetic differences that raise some interesting questions. One of them, and this is one that they found, the Bushmen were one of the oldest groups on the planet. You might expect their genes to reflect humanity's more ancestral state. So essentially, Schuster, the author of this paper, found that only 6% of one of the tested Bushmen's SNPs in a sequence matched that of the equivalent chimpanzee genome. So there's only 6% matching in one particular area. It's not the whole genome, to be clear. By comparison, the same positions in the human reference genome is an 87% match, which is a huge amount of difference, and has a whole heap of implications about like exactly where, how long ago we split off. Potentially, splitting off before we split from Pan is one potential outcome, or that there is some sort of merging between population groups that had split off an earlier time. What would become the Khoisan after they split from humanity? They merged with that one that had split off well before, or something like that. But there's no other evidence to imply that per se. But it's just a really interesting thing that only 6% of the SNPs actually matched up with Pan, which is ridiculous. I think we just lost Kathy. Anyway, Lawrence, did you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I actually missed a lot of it because my internet's shitting the bed at the moment.
Okay, so
So yeah, I was getting some pretty bad breakup. But from what I did hear, yes, it was very interesting stuff. Yeah, the Bantu displaced the Khoisan because they had agriculture, which gave them an advantage. Something that's talked about in Guns, Germs, and Steel. And yeah, they basically drove them off the most productive land and drove them into the worst land. The survivors were, I mean, the men were killed off, the women were taken as slaves, and yeah, it wasn't really good for them. And yeah, it's not really something you hear much about. You hear a lot about colonialism, about the horrible things white people did to other populations, but you don't hear about the Bantu migrations and the people they displaced.
yeah, because only white people ever did any sort of colonialism. Like, it's by definition.
Exactly.
But yeah, that was that's something I should have talked a little bit more about. The Bantu as a people, they were, like I said, Central and Eastern Africa, but there's also some recent implication that basically they, this is that Russian guy, the Russian geneticist stuff. I can't remember his name.
Kleosov.
Is it Kleosov? Actually, okay, what we're going to do for a second, we're just going to take a break here and then we'll come back to it in a sec because Kathy's trying to rejoin us because she dropped out in the middle of my talk. All right, we are back. Sorry about that. I'll just cut all that out. Kathy dropped out for a moment because of, wonderful internet. Anyway, you had something to mention about the Bantu's colonialism of the Khoisan.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, at the moment, the way South Africa is kind of a mix of like Bantus and Bantu Khoisan admixture, and then the Bushmen are still around there as well in the pure form. And am I wrong to imagine that they're the ones with the epicanthic folds?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Like Nelson Mandela.
Yeah.
He sort of has that,
Asian
eyes
look,
like
Chinese
an
look.
Asian.
Yeah. It's an interesting adaptation as well. This with the thing you mentioned about the chimpanzee genome in that particular area, with them being so different, I wonder how much of like other human species that were present at the time in that area. There would have been a lot of intermingling of the Khoisan ancestors with those people, and how much that has to do with like how genetically divergent they are. It's really hard to know anything because of the lack of any archaeological evidence of like what human species lived there. But obviously they're just so different that they must have intermingled with their own kind of quote unquote Neanderthals, like we have.
Yeah, obviously not Neanderthals, but some sort of. I touched on that. That's one potential answer for it. The only problem with that is it's the only piece of evidence that there could be, and there are other explanations. So it's not really we just don't have enough information to say one way or the other. Basically, the other option is, of course, that the split happened a lot earlier. And they, we're talking pre-emergence of chimps. And that is, something around 13 to 8 million years ago? Which is a long time, so that's kind of a bit unlikely. But maybe some sort of like combination of the two doing something weird. Like that, there isn't a good explanation for it yet. But it's really interesting.
Yeah, it really is. It's they're just so kind of genetically unique, and I think there was one, I don't remember which show it was, probably one of the Daily Shows that J.O. was on, when he was the one who mentioned that they're not the same as blacks. So I think that's something that's worth reiterating, that they're not the same as sub-Saharan blacks. There are different a human outgrowth, you know.
Yeah, like I mentioned, there is as much difference between us and sub-Saharan Africans as between them and sub-Saharan Africans.
Yeah.
There's as much...
Well, that's the left.
Pun?
Well, I mean, yeah, there just is an extraordinary amount of genetic diversity in the continent of Africa. And I don't want to sound like a leftist, but you can't lump Africa into one single population group. When we say Africa, colloquially, we kind of mean West Africa, West Africans. But yeah, I mean, when you look at East Africans with their high amount of Arab admixture.
Yeah.
Yep, exactly. I mean, yeah, like Ethiopians. As far as advanced civilization goes in Africa, a lot of it is East African because of that genetic and cultural exchange with the Arab world, the Arab traders.
Yeah, it's, you know, it's something that's kind of obvious when you think about it. We're fairly well established already on the show, you know. IQ is one of the many traits that, you know, averages out from breeding. So if you have a higher IQ and a low IQ population that, you know, breed together, the resultant population will be will be somewhere in the middle of that. And it would make sense that, you know, the group that has the higher level of inbreeding with a higher IQ outgroup is the one that's going to be the most civilized, the one that's going to have the things that more closely resemble civilization than, say, the 60 IQ Khoisan who never really got beyond, never really got to the point where they started doing any sort of permanent settling until colonialism.
I mean, if you look at sort of the most advanced African civilizations, I mean, they pretty much are all Muslim. And since they didn't independently invent Islam, they must have got it from somewhere. So, yeah, it's cultural...
What about the Egyptian?
It was Kangs.
The Kangs.
Yeah.
They had two pharaohs, didn't they? Or
Very
something like
bad
that.
pharaohs.
Yeah, it was like the fall of the Egyptian
the
Empire.
Obamas
Sort
of the Egyptian
Obamas.
Empire.
Yeah. Oh, I just... Yeah. Actually, it's just on that note, I've actually got one of my housemates watching Hidden Colors.
Oh, no.
It's glorious. But,
Yeah.
yeah, it's, you know, it's not... You know, you shouldn't be expecting, like, these groups to have, like, these great civilizations, like, just purely based off, like, just, you know, all of this should be kind of obvious. It feels, you know, weird that you sort of have to lay it out for a lot of people.
Yeah. Something you mentioned about when you were talking about lactose tolerance, I just wanted to make the point that any shitlib that kind of follows... fucking love science. They always say, well, don't you know that some African tribes are also lactose tolerant and they've never heard of convergent evolution and therefore race ain't real. So that's...
Yeah, and the same with some Asians. Was it the higher, not the higher caste, the nobility and all of that sort of stuff. They're the ones who typically have, or, you know, who are descended from them, typically have some lactose tolerance, I believe, or it might be the lower class. It's one of the two. And, you know, they were relatively separate groups up until fairly recently, and that's where that comes from in them. But it's, you know, it's kind of like, yeah, it's like you said, it's just because I think a better example is dolphins and sharks. One's a fish, one's a mammal.
But they both have the thing.
But they both look
fin.
pretty similar.
Yeah.
And that's a fantastic example of convergent evolution. It's basically because the pressures on them are so similar. They basically need to hunt prey in the same environment. So, of course, they're going to, when they've picked the same style of strategy, of course, they're going to be very similar in how they evolve. Whereas, you know, it's just kind of like people have like this sort of expectation that if one thing is the same, everything has to be the same. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah. like I mentioned with the Andamanese as well, I mean, they look like pygmies because of convergent evolution too. So yeah, that's just another good example of that. And we can find as many examples as anybody wants. And
yeah, it's just evolution, because I think it's also it's a generalized misunderstanding of how evolution works, and they kind of see it as like the they kind of see it as that it's direct, like a lot of people's mental interpretation of it's directed in a way, like, you know, when you see the picture of the yeah, okay. Oh, we'll do that in a sec. We'll wrap it in a sec. When you see the picture of like the apes going from from the tadpole to people sort of thing, that picture that everyone knows, a lot of people sort of assume that humans were the end goal of it, and that it's not. There's not like, it's almost like a religious way of looking at it, but that's not the case. It is random, like it's finding a random solution to a problem. But anyway, that's a discussion for a whole nother time. So I think we'll probably wrap up here.
cool.
Sounds good.
Okay, yeah, so this has been episode 34 of the Darwin Digest, where we've been discussing some of the more different populations. Next week, we're going to be covering the North. So native Indians, American Indians.
Finns.
Finns.
The Finnish.
the alien populations. Are Finns human? We'll find out next week.
Question.
Anyway, that's it for this week. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.